week 3 of the fantasy football season, and his quarterback sits every matchup this week. Thursday Night Football division matchup, AFC East, New England Patriots travel to the New York Jets. Jacoby Brissett, I thought he's looked all right in the first 2 games of the season, but he's not a fantasy option. He's not going to get a lot of points. He's not going to drive the football down the field. He's more of a game manager and a veteran presence at this point of his NFL career. And this week versus a tough New York Jet defense, he's a sit. Aaron Rodgers, first 2 games back off the Achilles to start the season. I thought it's been pretty decent for Aaron Rodgers. He's got good weapons, Garrett Wilson, Breece Hall out of the backfield. Mike Williams, we haven't seen much out of him yet. Allen Lazard, former teammate with the Packers, had a good week 1. But this week in a matchup where I think it's going to be a grinded out division ball game, Aaron Rodgers at best is still a borderline option because he's not putting up elite numbers. And I still believe he's not 100% as well. Denver Broncos at the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Bo Nix is a sit for me in this one. So far, Bo Nix really hasn't looked great in his first 2 career starts in the NFL. And it's tough when you don't have big-time wide receivers or a big-time running back in the middle of the pack offensive line. So this week, traveling to Tampa with a pretty solid defense, especially at home. Bo Nix, he's not in a position to be starting in your basic formats and as a sit. Baker Mayfield, one of the better quarterbacks so far in the first couple weeks. And he's been a hot pickup over the last week for fantasy owners is Baker Mayfield. And now this week with a beatable matchup versus the Denver Broncos coming to town in Tampa Bay. I think Baker Mayfield in this offense once again goes out there, has a good ball game with Chris Godwin and Mike Evans at the wide receiver position. And like I said, Mayfield, even going back to last season, had some big fantasy games, and he got $100 million for a reason. So this week, he's a start. Houston Texans at the Minnesota Vikings. CJ Stroud, he's a start each and every week. He was a top 5, top 6 quarterback off the board in fantasy drafts, and you're going to just put him in your starting lineup. You know he's going to be amongst the league leaders in passing the football. He's got great weapons, Nico Collins, Stephon Diggs, and he's matchup proof. And I know this Minnesota Viking team has played great football the first 2 weeks of the season, but CJ Stroud, this kid's got the it factor. And this week, once again, I think he has a good game. There's Sam Darnold so far. He's played good football, no doubt about it. But I think teams are going to start to catch up to Sam Darnold sooner than later. I don't think Sam Darnold, after all these years in the NFL, backing up and going from team to team, is all of a sudden going to find it because he's had opportunities with the New York Jets to start his career. The Carolina Panthers, he was a backup last season for the San Francisco 49ers, and now the starter because J.J. McCarthy went down in training camp. And this week versus middle of the pack, Houston Texan defense, and we'll see if Justin Jefferson does play in this game, even though he said he will. I just can't trust Sam Darnold 100%. Right now as a starter in fantasy leagues. As a backup, sure, but as a starter, I don't think so. Los Angeles Chargers at the Pittsburgh Steelers. Justin Herbert, he had a nice game in week 2 with the Carolina Panthers, but this week a tough matchup at the Steelers, and I just don't want any part of Justin Herbert. And also, he's not 100%. We'll see if he plays in this game or not for this Los Angeles Charger team. So this week with a tough matchup and not a lot of great weapons around Herbert this season, he's a sit this week. Justin Fields' first 2 games, we really haven't seen the rushing prowess from Fields. I know week 1 he had 57 rush yards on 14 attempts, and then last week only 26 yards rushing for Justin Fields. So Fields, he hasn't ran out of the pocket. They're trying to make him more of a pocket quarterback is a Steeler team. And that's why I believe you're not seeing a lot of results and touchdowns from Pittsburgh in the early going. That Justin Fields is trying too hard to stay in the pocket and make the correct reads and the correct throws. But so far it's worked out there 2-0. Like I said, I know Fields, he's not lighting it up and putting big points on the scoreboard, but he's playing in the system and playing well. But in terms of fantasy football, that does cap him a little bit if he's not going to run the football. So he's a borderline option in a mid-matchup. Philadelphia Eagles at New Orleans Saints. Jalen Hurts, he had a big game in week 2 in an upset loss versus the Atlanta Falcons, where the Falcons drove down at the end of the game, scored a touchdown, and then Hurts had a chance to get him in field goal range and threw an interception. But Jalen Hurts, he's a stud quarterback, second or third quarterback off the board in most fantasy drafts. And with his running ability and he's looking healthy in the early going, even in a tougher matchup at the Saints, he's matchup proof, I believe, Jalen Hurts. And you drafted him as a top QB for a reason. He's a start. Derek Carr, first 2 weeks of the year, one of the better quarterbacks. And fantasy football this season, quarterbacks have struggled mightily. Even the top guys. We saw Josh Allen. He had a bad week 2 in fantasy points. Patrick Mahomes, his numbers haven't been all that great. Anthony Richardson, one great game, one bad game. So far, mixed results for a lot of quarterbacks, but Derek Carr's had 2 great games. And this week versus a leaky Eagles secondary, he's a start. Green Bay Packers at the Titans, pretty straightforward. Malik Willis most likely going to start once again for this Packer team. He's a sit. He's not going to throw the football a whole lot. They're going to run the football a whole lot with Josh Jacobs once again, I believe, is this Packer team. And Tennessee's defense is pretty solid, so I don't believe Willis will do much. Will Levis, first 2 weeks, we haven't seen much out of him. No, he hit a couple big throws in last week's game versus the New York Jets, but still, Will Levis, the bad turnovers, taking some big hits, taking some sacks. And this week versus the middle of the pack Green Bay defense, he's a sit for me. New York Giants at the Cleveland Browns, Daniel Jones a sit. And I know last week he was a little bit better performance at the Washington Commanders, but the Giants still lost that game. And Daniel Jones had a middle-of-the-pack game, so this week versus one of the better defenses in the league going to the dog pound in Cleveland, there's no way I could trust Daniel Jones in the spot. He's a sit. Deshaun Watson a sit. Last week, a little bit better it was for Deshaun Watson at the Jacksonville Jaguars, but even in a plus matchup versus the New York Giants, one of the worst defenses in all of pro football, I can't trust Deshaun Watson to go out there and have a performance. He hasn't been a good quarterback for many years in fantasy football with off-the-field issues and injuries the last couple seasons, and him and Amari Cooper aren't on the same page. I know some good news that David Njoku possibly could play in this week's ball game, which is another much-needed weapon added to the offense. But still, Watson, I can't trust him even in a good matchup. He's a sit. Chicago Bears, Indianapolis Colts. Caleb Williams is a sit. First 2 weeks of his NFL career, he's looked like a mid-quarterback. I know it's only 2 weeks. I know there's tons of season left, but Caleb Williams, I can't trust in these fantasy leagues right now where he's taking big hits and he's not on the same page with DJ Moore. He's missed some throws with him. He's chucking the football down the field through 2 bad interceptions in last week's game with the Texans. And this week, I know it's not a horrible matchup where the Colts defense isn't all that great, but it's tough to trust Caleb Williams on the road, especially what we've seen the first 2 weeks. Anthony Richardson's a start for me. I believe Anthony Richardson, he's going to be a monster at home fantasy-wise this season, but on the road, he's going to have his struggles like we saw in week 2 at Green Bay. So Anthony Richardson has the cannon arm. He's going to run the football a lot, and these quarterbacks with the running ability is where you're going to pay. It's going to pay dividends for your fantasy team more times than not. So this week in a pretty decent matchup, Richardson's a start. Miami Dolphins at the Seattle Seahawks. Skylar Thompson most likely going to be the starting quarterback, unless Tyler Huntley picks up this playbook out of nowhere quickly for this Miami Dolphin team. But it's going to be Thompson getting the first crack, and he's a sit. He still has great weapons, though. Tyreek Hill, Jalen Waddle, Devon Achane out of the backfield. But Thompson, I can't trust him going into Seattle, where their defense has been pretty decent in the first couple weeks, playing grinded out ball games. Is a Seattle Seahawks team, and he's a sit. Geno Smith to start. So far, first 2 weeks of the year, Geno Smith's been a solid quarterback and a top 10 quarterback in fantasy points scored. And when you got great weapons like DK Metcalf, Jackson Smith-Njigba, and Tyler Lockett at times, I think still going to go out there and have his games every few weeks. Geno Smith has a good arsenal. He's got good weapons. And in this new offense and new offensive coordinator all around, a whole new system for the Seattle Seahawks team. So far, it's paid good dividends, and they're 2-0 to begin the year. Carolina Panthers at the Vegas Raiders. Bryce Young, he was benched for the veteran Andy Dalton. And I think Dalton, he can move the football down the field better. He can't do any worse than Bryce Young, who looks like one of the worst busts we've seen in the last decade at the quarterback position. But Dalton, I don't believe, could go in Las Vegas and light up the scoreboard and put up points. Dalton's definitely going to take his shots downfield and make some plays, but I just can't trust Andy Dalton, the veteran, at this point of his career with a bad offensive line in front of him. He's a sit. Gardner Minshew is a sit as well. I know this is a good matchup. It wouldn't be surprising to me if this Raider offense has some trouble at times moving the football. I know they went into Baltimore. They won that ball game and they grinded out 26-23. Minshew, Brock Bowers have a good rapport. Davante Adams got back on track with 9 catches, 110 yards, and found the end zone. But it's tough for me to go out there and tell you to start Gardner Minshew in 12, 14-team leagues. Baltimore Ravens at the Dallas Cowboys. Lamar Jackson, obviously, he's a start each and every week. Top 5 quarterback at worst off the board. He's going to give you the rushing yards. And now with this Raven team 0-2, and Lamar's back against the wall, I think he goes into Dallas and has a big game. And we saw Derek Carr last week have a monster game. And also Alvin Kamara. So I think Lamar could be one of his best games of the season coming up this week. Dak Prescott is sit the first 2 weeks Since getting the contract extension, Dak Prescott hasn't done much. Week 1, he only had 13 fantasy points. And last week, about the same range. Wade threw a couple interceptions. So this week versus a tough defense in the Baltimore Ravens. I know it's a home game for Dallas. I know the Raiders just came off and beat him. I just can't trust Dak Prescott week in and week out. Wins are limited. And if Jake Ferguson's not playing in this game as well, that's another solid weapon taken away from Dak this week. San Francisco 49ers at the Rams. I'll give Brock Purdy the start. I know Christian McCaffrey's down, but Jordan Mason's filled in very well for this Niner team. And also now Deebo Samuel out a couple weeks as well with injury, which always hits for Deebo. He just can't stay healthy for this Niner team. But Brock Purdy, I think they got to put the ball in his hands more. And this week at the Los Angeles Rams in their home opener, I think Purdy goes out there and has a decent game. We saw Kyler Murray have a big ball game versus them last week. And I think Brock Purdy knows now when McCaffrey out, he's got to take charge a little bit and get that football down the field. Matthew Stafford is sit. And Matthew Stafford, it's been tough sledding, taking big hits. And to lose your 2 top receivers in 2 weeks, Puka Nacua in week 1 with the knee injury. And then last week, Cooper Kupp limping, hurting the ankle, and he's going to be out multiple weeks. So Matthew Stafford in a tough matchup versus a great defense. And with his top 2 weapons out, he's an easy sit. Detroit Lions, Arizona Cardinals. Borderline option is Jared Goff. He's got great weapons. Amon-Ra St. Brown. Sam Laporta, even though he's had 2 off weeks to start the season. And Jameson Williams, who's definitely emerging. Jahmyr Gibbs out of the backfield as a good pass catcher. But this week in a matchup at Arizona, we know Jared Goff, his home-away splits over the last few seasons haven't looked pretty. So at best, I'm going to say in a potential shootout, I have Goff as a borderline option. Kyler Murray is start. Last week, a monster ball game, over 30 fantasy points for Kyler Murray. And Murray, I said coming into the year, coming off the ACL, another year healthier, he's going to have a good season, and he has great weapons in Marvin Harrison that went off in that game. Trey McBride and that running back James Conner so far looking good. So pretty much every week, Kyler Murray's a start. Sunday Night Football, Kansas City Chiefs at the Falcons. Patrick Mahomes so far early going. Fantasy numbers had been mediocre for Mahomes' standard, but Rashee Rice has looked good. Travis Kelce has been non-existent, but I believe Travis Kelce gets on track in this ball game. Xavier Worthy had a good week 1. We'll see if he gets back on track after he didn't do anything in week 2. But this matchup inside, primetime football, indoors, I think Mahomes has a big ball game at the Falcons. And we just saw Jalen Hurts have a big game on Monday night. Now to Kirk Cousins, he's a sit. Kirk Cousins, he pretty much didn't do much the first 3 quarters of that game. But then 4th quarter, game on the line, he drove down quickly and scored, hitting Drake London in the end zone and scoring. So this Falcon team has great weapons. Bijan Robinson, one of the best backs in the league. Kyle Pitts at the tight end position. Drake London. Darnell Mooney, a deep ball threat. And a quick wide receiver in Ray McLeod. So I like the weapons for Atlanta, but this Kansas City Chiefs defense, one of the better units in the league, and I think it's going to be tough for Cousins this week. First of 2 Monday nights, Jacksonville Jaguars at the Buffalo Bills. Trevor Lawrence, we haven't seen much out of him. Last season, it was a down year for him, and so far in the early going this year, it's a down year. So this week in a tough matchup at a Bill defense, I know they lost a ton of players in the offseason, but their defense is playing good. And Lawrence, I can't trust. He's a sit. Josh Allen to start each and every week. First quarterback off the board. I know last week was a down week, but this week, versus a mediocre to poor defense, he goes out there on Monday night, and he's in must-start. Final game of the week, second of the Monday night slate. Washington Commanders at the Cincinnati Bengals. Jaden Daniels with his rushing upside. I know last week I expected, and many people did, a big game out of him, but he didn't do much versus the New York Giants. But in a game where they're most likely going to be trailing early and often, and he's going to have to use his legs and arm to make some things happen. I think Jaden Daniels has a bounce-back game and is a start in his first nationally televised ball game. And Joe Burrow's a start for me as well. I thought Joe Burrow did a good job versus a good Chief defense in week 2, but obviously the Bengals fell short in that one. If Jamar Chase could get his head back in the game after some bad penalties and frustration last week for Chase versus the Kansas City Chiefs, I think this Cincinnati Bengal team could have a good ball game. And Joe Burrow, he likes spreading that football out. And we'll see if T. Higgins returns in this game as well, where he could be a much-needed weapon. So that's quarterback start sit every matchup for week 3 of the fantasy football season.